They forced a rancher to guard a fierce Apache girl, but seeing her, he realized he must let her go. The Arizona Territory, in the year of 1878, was not merely land. It was a wound that refused to heal, a place where every grain of sand seemed to whisper the names of the fallen, where the sun scorched not just the earth, but the very souls of those who dared to claim dominion over it. The conflict between the Chiricahua Apache and the United States Cavalry had transformed this vast expanse into something more than a battlefield. It had become a graveyard of trust, a proving ground for cruelty, where mercy was considered weakness and compassion a betrayal of one's own blood. In this forsaken corner of the world, hatred breathed as naturally as the desert wind, and terror walked hand in hand with the rising sun. Elijah Thorne had once been a different man. 35 years had carved deep lines into his weathered face, lines that spoke of loss more eloquent than any words he could ever summon. He had been a rancher, a husband, a father, roles that now seemed to belong to someone else entirely, to a phantom from a gentler time that the frontier had long since devoured. The cavalry found use for men like him, men whose spirits had been hollowed out by tragedy, leaving only the shell of competence and the desperate need for survival. They called him a scout, a tracker, a guard for hire. He called himself nothing at all, preferring the numbness of routine duty to the agony of remembering what he had once been. When the officers approached him with their proposition, their voices carrying that particular blend of authority and contempt reserved for civilians doing military work, he accepted without hesitation. Guard the Apache prisoner overnight, simple, impersonal, the kind of task that required nothing of his heart, only his presence and his rifle. The outpost squatted like a scar upon the landscape, a crude assemblage of weathered timber and rusted iron that proclaimed the government's temporary claim on this hostile territory. As twilight descended, and the desert began its nightly transformation from furnace to freezer, Elijah made his way toward the holding area, his boots crunching against the hard-packed earth with a rhythm that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The other soldiers gave him wide berth, their eyes sliding past him with the practiced indifference of men who recognized a kindred soul. Someone who had crossed too many moral boundaries to ever find his way back to innocence. The air itself seemed to thicken as he approached the cage, that particular quality of silence that precedes a moment of irreversible consequence settling over everything like a suffocating blanket. What the officers had described as a dangerous savage, a wild creature requiring iron bars and armed supervision, was revealed in the pale moonlight to be something entirely different. Ayanna sat with her back straight despite the cramped confines of the cell, her hands bound with rope that had rubbed her wrists raw, her clothing torn and stained with the evidence of capture and confinement. But it was her eyes that stopped Elijah cold, that shattered the careful armor of indifference he had spent years constructing. They were not the eyes of a beaten captive or a terrified prisoner. They held an undefeated spirit, an ancient dignity that spoke of generations who had walked this land when his ancestors were still across the ocean, dreaming of new worlds to conquer. She did not plead. She did not rage. She simply looked at him with an unwavering gaze that saw past his uniform, past his rifle, directly into the withered core of his humanity. And in that single moment of connection, everything he thought he understood about duty and survival began to crumble. The night stretched before him like an accusation. The first hours of his watch passed in a silence so profound it felt almost sacred, broken only by the distant sounds of the outpost settling into its uneasy sleep, the murmur of card games in the officers' quarters, the nervous laughter of young soldiers trying to forget where they were and what they had been ordered to do. Elijah positioned himself on a worn wooden stool several feet from the cage, his rifle resting across his knees, maintaining the posture of a professional guard, while his mind waged a war against itself. He had convinced himself, over the long years since his family's death, that survival required the suppression of empathy, that in this brutal landscape, compassion was a luxury that would get a man killed. Yet every time his gaze drifted toward the woman in the cage, that carefully constructed philosophy felt increasingly hollow. A lie he had told himself so many times, It had almost become truth. Ayanna remained motionless, her breathing so controlled she might have been carved from the very stone of the mountains her people called home. She was, Elijah understood with growing clarity, engaged in her own form of warfare, a battle of will and endurance that required no weapons beyond an unbreakable spirit. The soldiers who had captured her spoke of her with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, their stories painting her as some kind of demon woman who had fought like 10 warriors, who had refused to surrender, even when her companions lay fallen around her. They spoke of her as though she were less than human, a justification for the cruelties they planned to inflict. But sitting here in the cool desert night, watching the moonlight trace shadows across her proud features, Elijah could see only a woman of extraordinary courage, someone who had chosen to stand against an overwhelming force, rather than abandon her people or her principles. His hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching for the canteen at his belt. The simple act of uncorking it seemed to echo in the stillness, causing Ayanna's eyes to shift toward him for the first time since he had taken up his post. He stood slowly, every movement deliberate and unthreatening, and approached the bars with the canteen extended. The regulations were clear. Prisoners received water twice daily at prescribed intervals, carefully rationed to ensure compliance without encouraging strength. What he was doing constituted a clear violation of protocol, a small act of defiance that could result in disciplinary action if observed. He poured the water into a tin cup and slid it through the bars, their fingers not quite touching as she accepted it with a dignity that suggested she was receiving a gift between equals rather than accepting charity from a captor. She drank deeply but without desperation, her self-control absolute even in her thirst. When she lowered the cup, something passed between them. Not quite trust, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile recognition that he was not entirely aligned with the men who had caged her. Elijah found himself speaking, his voice rough from disuse and uncertainty, offering details that served no tactical purpose, but seemed important nonetheless. He spoke of the desert as he had known it before the war intensified, of hidden springs and secret valleys where wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the harsh sun, of the hawks that circled on thermals and the way the mountains turned purple at sunset. These were not the words of a guard to a prisoner, but of one exile to another, of two people who understood that the land itself was neutral in the conflicts of men, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. The connection forming between them was as dangerous as dynamite, as forbidden as any treaty violation. When Ayanna finally spoke, her English was accented but clear, shaped by the teaching of missionaries she had likely despised even as she learned from them. She asked him about the flowers he had mentioned, about whether the blue ones still grew near the eastern ridges. The question revealed so much: her intimate knowledge of this terrain, her longing for freedom, her test of his honesty. He answered truthfully, describing their location with a precision that could aid her escape should she somehow achieve it, and in doing so, he crossed a line from which there would be no returning. He was no longer simply a guard performing a distasteful duty. He had become, in the span of a few whispered words, something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. A man who had begun to see his prisoner as fully human, as someone whose life held equal value to his own. As dawn approached and his shift neared its end, Elijah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours before. With hands that trembled slightly, he loosened the ropes binding her wrists, not enough to allow escape but enough to restore circulation, to grant a small mercy that acknowledged her suffering. Ayanna's eyes widened fractionally, the only indication of her surprise, before that mask of dignity settled once more over her features. But he had seen it, that moment of vulnerability, and it bound him to her fate more surely than any oath or contract ever could. When the relief guard arrived with the harsh light of morning, commenting with casual cruelty about the prisoner's stubborn refusal to break, Elijah felt a cold rage kindle in his chest that he barely managed to conceal. He walked away from that cage knowing he had left something of himself behind, something he had thought long dead, his capacity to care about another person's suffering, enough to risk everything to end it. The outpost operated on the predictable rhythms of military life, a routine designed to impose order on the chaos of frontier warfare. Elijah moved through the following day in a fog of exhaustion and mounting dread, his body going through the familiar motions while his mind remained trapped in that moonlit space between the bars, where human connection had defied every rule and reason. He tried to lose himself in mundane tasks, checking supplies, mending tack, performing the countless small chores that filled a scout's hours, but his thoughts kept circling back to Ayanna, to the quiet strength she had displayed, to the growing certainty that her continued imprisonment was not just unjust, but an active evil he was complicit in maintaining. The other men at the outpost moved around him like shadows, their conversations washing over him unheard, their casual cruelties toward the prisoner burning in his ears like brands. It was late afternoon when he overheard the conversation that would transform him from reluctant accomplice to active rebel. Two officers stood in the narrow shade of the supply building, their voices carrying in the still air with the confidence of men who believed themselves unobserved. They spoke of Ayanna with clinical detachment, discussing her upcoming transfer to Fort Bowie where, they assured each other with grim satisfaction, the interrogators had methods that broke even the most stubborn Apache resistance. The words they used were coded, dressed in the language of military necessity, but their meaning was transparent to anyone who had spent time on this frontier. What they described was not interrogation, but torture, a systematic destruction of body and spirit that would end, inevitably and by design, in death. The transfer was scheduled for the following dawn, which meant this night, the night he would again be assigned to guard her, would be her last chance at survival. The revelation hit Elijah with the force of physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and sending his heart into a frantic rhythm against his ribs. All the carefully maintained distance, all the rationalizations he had constructed to justify his participation in this machinery of oppression, collapsed in an instant. He saw with crystalline clarity that there were only two paths before him. He could remain the broken, compliant man the frontier had made him, allowing an innocent woman to be destroyed because intervening would cost him everything, or he could act on the buried sense of right and wrong that Ayanna's dignity had somehow resurrected in him, knowing that such action would instantly make him an enemy of the government he had served, a fugitive hunted with the same relentless determination currently reserved for Apache warriors. The choice, when it came, felt less like a decision than a revelation of who he had always been beneath the armor of cynicism and despair. His wife, in the last days before the fever took her, had told him that a man's character was revealed not in moments of safety, but in moments of terrible choice, when doing the right thing cost everything and doing nothing cost only one's soul. He had failed so many tests since her death, had allowed himself to become something she would have been ashamed to recognize. But this woman, this stranger from a people he had been taught to fear and despise, had somehow given him a chance at redemption, an opportunity to prove that some core of decency still existed within him, despite all the years of compromise and moral erosion. The risks were absolute. Capture would mean execution for treason. Flight would mean abandoning everything he had built. Success would mean living forever as a hunted man. But the alternative, standing by while Ayanna was destroyed, had become literally unthinkable. As twilight descended once more, and he took up his position outside her cage for what would be either their last night together or the first night of a desperate flight, Elijah felt a strange calm settle over him. Ayanna's eyes found his in the gathering darkness, and he saw in them a flicker of recognition, as though she had sensed the change in him, the transformation from guard to something else entirely. He did not speak of his plan. The walls had ears and trust was still a fragile thing between them, but he allowed his gaze to linger on the rusted lock, on the shadows that marked the patrol routes, on the distant mountains that promised either freedom or death. When he finally met her eyes again, he saw understanding there, and something else, a warrior's acknowledgement of a fellow combatant, of someone who had chosen to stand against overwhelming odds for nothing more than the preservation of honor and human dignity. The moon rose slowly, painting the desert in shades of silver and shadow, and Elijah Thorne began his vigil, no longer as a guard but as a conspirator, counting down the hours until he would either save a life or destroy his own in the attempt. The outpost settled into its nightly routine with the oblivious predictability that Elijah was counting on for their survival. He had spent the intervening hours mapping every detail, with the precision of a man for whom failure would mean not just his own death, but the destruction of the woman whose life had become, inexplicably and irrevocably, more important than his own. The key to the cage hung in the officers' quarters, suspended from a nail driven into the rough timber wall, with a carelessness that spoke to the soldiers' absolute confidence in their control. Acquiring it would require a brazen theft executed in the narrow window between the officers' drunken card game and their eventual collapse into sleep, a timing so precise that even a moment's miscalculation would spell disaster. He waited with the patience of a predator, his body motionless in the shadows while his mind raced through every possible contingency. The sounds of the camp gradually diminished, laughter fading to murmurs, murmurs giving way to snores, the restless energy of armed men slowly surrendering to exhaustion. When he finally moved, it was with the silent efficiency of smoke, his years of frontier living having taught him which boards creaked and which shadows offered true concealment. The officers' quarters stank of whiskey and unwashed bodies, the air thick with the sounds of men lost in the temporary oblivion of alcohol and exhaustion. His hand closed around the key with infinite care, lifting it from its nail with a control so absolute that even the faint scrape of metal on wood seemed thunderous to his heightened senses. Back outside, moving through the pools of darkness between the scattered buildings, Elijah approached Ayana's cage with his heart hammering so violently he was certain it would wake the entire camp. She was waiting, her body coiled with readiness despite the hours of stillness, her eyes tracking his approach with an intensity that suggested she had been preparing for this moment since the instant their gazes had first met. The lock resisted for one terrible, eternal second before yielding with a click that seemed to echo across the entire desert. The cage door swung open on hinges that protested faintly, and Ayana stepped through that threshold from captivity to potential freedom, with a grace that belied the hours of confinement, her bare feet making no sound against the hard earth. They moved as a single unit, despite never having rehearsed, her warrior's instincts meshing perfectly with his scout's knowledge of the terrain and the camp's blind spots. The perimeter sentries followed their predictable routes, bored men going through the motions of duty in a place where weeks could pass without incident. Elijah and Ayana flowed through the gaps in their coverage like water finding cracks in stone, utilizing every shadow, every structure, every moment of inattention. The most dangerous passage came at the camp's eastern boundary, where a young soldier stood his post with the slightly more alert bearing of someone new to the frontier, still believing the regulations about vigilance actually mattered. They waited in the darkness mere feet from his position, their breathing synchronized and nearly silent, until the natural rhythm of human attention caused his gaze to drift toward the distant mountains, and in that instant they slipped past him into the open desert beyond. The first mile was covered at a punishing pace, both of them knowing that discovery could come at any moment, and that distance was their only ally in the opening phase of this desperate gamble. The desert floor was treacherous in the darkness, studded with rocks and cacti that could turn an ankle or tear flesh, but Ayana moved with the confidence of someone who had traversed this landscape since childhood, her feet finding purchase where Elijah's boots struggled. When they finally paused in the shelter of a rock formation, both gasping for breath, she spoke for only the second time since their escape began, her words shaped by an emotion he could not quite identify. She told him that her people had a word for what he was doing, for the act of a man from one tribe risking everything to save someone from another. They called it the greatest form of courage, the willingness to stand against one's own people when they embraced evil. Behind them, carried on the cold desert wind, came the sound they had been dreading, the sudden eruption of shouts as the empty cage was discovered, followed by the organized chaos of men being roused for pursuit. The cavalry's response would be swift and merciless. Elijah was under no illusions about their chances if the soldiers caught up with them. He was now officially a traitor, subject to immediate execution, while Ayana would face something far worse before being allowed the mercy of death. The hunt had begun in earnest, and their only hope lay in reaching terrain where horses could not follow, and where Ayana's knowledge of the land could give them an advantage over the superior numbers and firepower of their pursuers. They ran deeper into the night, toward the jagged silhouettes of the mountains that promised either sanctuary or a spectacular final stand against the forces that would see them both destroyed for the crime of recognizing each other's humanity. The Sierra Madre foothills rose before them like the broken teeth of some ancient stone god, their canyons and ridges offering a maze of passages that could conceal fugitives or trap them in dead ends from which there would be no escape. As the first gray light of dawn began to leak across the eastern horizon, Elijah and Ayana pushed themselves beyond exhaustion, their bodies running on nothing but will, and the certain knowledge that stopping meant death or worse. The desert had given way to more rugged terrain, rocks and scrub replacing sand, the altitude beginning to steal their breath even as it offered cover from the pursuing cavalry. Behind them, perhaps a mile distant now, the sounds of organized pursuit had resolved into something more specific and far more terrifying. The methodical advance of trained trackers who knew this land almost as well as the Apache themselves. Ayana led them deeper into the labyrinth of stone, her choices guided by a knowledge passed down through generations of her people, an intimate understanding of this landscape that went beyond mere geography into the realm of the sacred. She moved with increasing confidence despite her exhaustion, and Elijah realized with a mixture of hope and dread that she was leading them somewhere specific, toward some destination that held significance beyond mere concealment. They squeezed through a narrow defile where the walls pressed so close he could touch both sides simultaneously, emerged into a hidden valley where a thin stream fed vegetation that seemed impossible in this harsh environment, and climbed a series of natural stone steps that switchbacked up a cliff face in a pattern that looked random, but was clearly the work of ancient hands making a path. The sun had fully risen by the time they reached what Elijah initially took for a natural cave, but quickly recognized as something far more significant. A shelter that had been worked and expanded over countless generations, its entrance deliberately obscured, but its interior showing evidence of sustained use over centuries. Ayana paused at the threshold, her exhaustion momentarily overcome by an expression of profound relief and spiritual homecoming. This was not merely a hiding place, it was a sanctuary of her people, a location that held deep meaning for the Chiricahua, perhaps a place where ceremonies had been conducted, or where families had sheltered during previous conflicts with invaders. The walls bore markings, painted symbols and carved images that told stories Elijah could not read but understood, were chronicles of survival, resistance, and the enduring presence of a people who refused to be erased. They collapsed inside, their bodies finally demanding rest after the hours of relentless flight. Elijah's hands shook with exhaustion, and the aftermath of adrenaline as he checked their meager supplies, his rifle with a handful of cartridges, a canteen already half empty, a knife, and the clothes on their backs. It was insufficient for any kind of sustained resistance or prolonged flight, which meant their options were narrowing with every passing hour. Ayana sat with her back against the ancient stone wall, her eyes closed, her breathing gradually slowing from the ragged gasps of exertion to something more controlled. Even in this moment of relative safety, even in exhaustion, she maintained that core of dignity and strength that had first captured Elijah's attention back at the outpost. When she opened her eyes and looked at him, he saw in them a decision that had been forming throughout their flight. She spoke quietly, but with absolute certainty, telling him that this place was close to her people's current stronghold, that warriors would come here eventually to check the sacred sites, that if they could hold out for perhaps another day, she could be returned to her clan. But then her voice shifted, taking on a tone of painful honesty as she explained what he must have already known, that her warriors, when they came, would see him only as an enemy, that his act of liberation would mean nothing against years of warfare and bloodshed, that the best he could hope for was a quick death, rather than the prolonged vengeance her people had earned the right to inflict on captured soldiers. The words hung between them like a blade, sharp and undeniable, Elijah had understood from the moment he opened that cage that this flight was unlikely to end in anything resembling safety for him, that his choice to save Ayanna was also, in all probability, a choice to die. Yet hearing it stated so plainly, seeing in her eyes the genuine sorrow for what his mercy would cost him, brought a clarity that was almost peaceful. He told her, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion, that he had made his choice back at the outpost, that he would rather die having done one truly honorable thing than live another 30 years as the hollow, compromised man he had become. If her people's justice required his life as payment for his liberation of her, he would meet it with as much dignity as he could summon. The sound of their pursuers, temporarily lost in the maze of canyons, suddenly grew louder, more directed, suggesting the trackers had picked up their trail again and were closing the distance. Their moment of rest was over. The final phase of this desperate journey was beginning, and whatever waited at its end, reunion and execution, or some outcome neither of them could yet imagine, was now rushing toward them with the inevitability of a flash flood through a narrow canyon. They moved higher into the mountains, following paths that became increasingly treacherous and spiritually charged, markers of stone and wood, indicating they were entering the heart of Chiricahua territory. Ayanna's demeanor had shifted subtly, from fugitive to someone returning home despite the dangerous circumstances, her exhaustion giving way to a renewed energy that came from proximity to her people and her land. The landscape itself seemed to change in response to their approach, becoming more alive somehow, as though they were transitioning from mere geography into a place where every rock and tree held meaning, where the boundary between the physical and spiritual world grew thin enough to feel. The Apache warriors found them in the early afternoon, materializing from the terrain so suddenly and completely that Elijah barely had time to register their presence before he was surrounded by armed men, whose faces held the accumulated rage and grief of a people fighting for their very existence. There were 6 of them, lean and hard as the desert itself, their weapons a mixture of traditional bows and stolen rifles, their eyes assessing him with the flat, deadly calculation of predators who had cornered something that had been threatening their territory. Elijah slowly lowered his rifle to the ground, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that felt both necessary and utterly insufficient. His life now measured in heartbeats as these warriors decided his fate. Ayanna stepped forward, positioning herself between Elijah and the warriors, her voice ringing out with an authority that momentarily checked their advance. She spoke in rapid Chiricahua, her words tumbling over each other in her urgency to explain the circumstances of her escape, to make them understand that the man behind her was not like the others who had caged her, that he had risked everything to free her when he could have simply collected his pay and walked away from her suffering. The warriors' expressions remained hard, skeptical, their weapons still trained on Elijah with a steadiness that suggested they were moments away from ending this conversation in the most permanent way possible. The impasse was broken by the arrival of an older man, whose bearing and the deference shown him by the warriors marked him as someone of significant authority within the clan. His face was a map of years spent in the merciless sun and wind, lined with the weight of decisions that had kept his people alive through impossible odds, his eyes holding a depth of wisdom and sorrow that spoke to losses too numerous to count. He studied the scene before him, the exhausted white man who had surrendered his weapon, the fierce young woman of his clan positioned protectively between them, the warriors poised to execute summary justice, with the patience of someone who understood that hasty decisions often led to regret. Ayanna approached the elder, her words now measured and respectful, her case for Elijah's life made not through emotional appeal, but through a methodical recounting of facts. She described his acts of mercy at the outpost, his theft of the key, the risk he had taken in defying his own people's laws, the pursuit that even now was closing in on their position. She spoke of his willingness to guide her home, knowing that doing so would almost certainly cost him his life, of the moment she had seen his humanity shine through the armor of cynicism and defeat that the frontier had forced him to wear. The elder listened without interruption, his gaze occasionally shifting to Elijah, assessing not just his words but the truth written in his posture, in his eyes, in the quiet acceptance of whatever judgment was about to be rendered. When the elder finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of law and tradition, each word carefully chosen to balance justice with mercy, to honor both the legitimate rage of a people under siege and the undeniable truth of one man's extraordinary act of conscience. He acknowledged Elijah's courage and his mercy, stating that such actions deserved recognition even from those who had every reason to see him only as an enemy. But he also spoke of the reality they all lived within, the reality of a war that showed no signs of ending, of a people whose survival depended on maintaining absolute separation from their invaders, of the impossibility of allowing a former cavalry scout to remain among them without endangering everyone. The judgment, when it came, was both a gift and a curse. Ayanna would be restored to her people, her freedom absolute and her honor intact. Elijah would be granted his life, but only on the condition that he leave this territory immediately and never return, that he cross the border into Mexico and remain there, severing all connection to the land and the people he had known. The sentence was merciful by the standards of frontier justice, but it carved something vital out of Elijah's chest nonetheless. He would live, but as an exile from both worlds, no longer trusted by the government he had betrayed, no longer welcome among the people he had saved. The warriors began to move, their purpose now clear. They would escort him to the border and ensure his compliance with the elder's decree. But they would also protect him from any cavalry pursuers until he was safely beyond their reach. An honor guard for a man who had proven himself worthy of respect if not trust. Ayanna turned to him, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall, and in that moment, all the words they might have spoken seemed inadequate to the weight of what had passed between them. They had shared only days, most of it in crisis and flight, yet in that compressed time, they had forged a connection that transcended the boundaries of culture, language, and the bitter war that defined their world. The journey to the border took 2 days of hard travel through terrain that seemed designed to break both body and spirit. The Apache warriors setting a pace that pushed Elijah to the limits of his endurance, while simultaneously shielding him from the cavalry patrols that crisscrossed the region in search of the escaped prisoner and her traitorous guard. The warriors moved with a casual efficiency that spoke to their complete mastery of this landscape, reading signs in the dust and stones that were invisible to Elijah's trained but ultimately foreign eyes. They did not speak to him beyond what was absolutely necessary, their silence a mixture of lingering hostility and grudging respect, a recognition that he had done something remarkable, even if it did not erase the sins of his people or grant him entry into their circle of trust. On the evening of the first day, as they made camp in a hidden canyon where a fire could be lit without fear of detection, one of the younger warriors approached Elijah with a piece of dried meat and a water skin, the offering made without words, but with a nod that suggested something had shifted in how they perceived him. The gesture was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of their circumstance, yet it represented a crack in the wall of enmity that had defined relations between their peoples, a tiny acknowledgement that individual actions could sometimes transcend collective hatred. Elijah accepted the food with a gratitude that went beyond mere sustenance, understanding that he was being shown a form of respect he had done nothing in his previous life to earn, but which his choice to free Ayanna had somehow purchased. The cavalry never caught up to them, whether through the warriors' skill at concealment or through sheer luck Elijah could not say. And by the late afternoon of the second day, they reached a nondescript stretch of desert that marked the boundary between United States territory and Mexico. There were no markers here, no fence or stone cairn to indicate where one nation ended and another began, just an invisible line that existed primarily in the minds and maps of men who drew borders and expected the land itself to respect them. The warriors halted their advance, forming a loose semicircle that made clear this was as far as they would accompany him, that from this point forward he would walk alone into whatever future awaited him on the other side of that invisible boundary. The elder had not accompanied them, remaining with Ayanna at the stronghold, But the lead warrior now spoke for the first time since their journey began, his words halting but clear, shaped by a rudimentary English learned through necessity rather than choice. He told Elijah that what he had done for Ayanna would be remembered among their people, that the story would be told when the warriors gathered and the old men spoke of the times they lived in, that he would be remembered not as a friend, but as someone who had proven that honor could exist even across the deepest divide. The words were delivered without warmth, but also without mockery, a statement of simple fact from men who understood that in this harsh land, reputation and legend were often all that outlived a person's brief time beneath the sun. Elijah turned to face Mexico, that vast unknown territory that would now become his entire world, a land where he knew no one and nothing, where his past would be meaningless and his future uncertain. Every step away from this boundary would take him further from everything he had known. The landscape of his youth, the graves of his family, the familiar patterns of a life that, however compromised and hollow it had become, had at least been comprehensible. He was being granted life at the cost of belonging, survival at the price of exile, a trade that was both generous and devastating in its implications. Behind him lay pursuit and execution. Before him stretched an expanse of possibility that felt more like abandonment than freedom. He walked forward without looking back, his boots carrying him across that invisible line into a future that stretched empty and unknown to the horizon. Each step away from the Apache warriors, an erasure of his former self, and a reluctant acceptance of the person he would now have to become. Months passed in a blur of survival and adaptation, Elijah moving through the northern Mexican territories like a ghost, taking work where he could find it, and moving on when questions began to accumulate. The landscape was familiar in its harshness but foreign in its details. The people speaking a language he understood poorly, and looking at him with the wariness reserved for all displaced gringos who appeared in their midst without clear purpose or legitimate history. He found employment on ranches where the work was brutal and the pay meager, where his competence with horses and his willingness to perform the tasks other men avoided earned him a place, if not exactly acceptance. The nights were the hardest, when exhaustion failed to bring sleep, and his mind would drift back across that invisible border to the woman whose freedom had cost him everything he had left. He wondered if Ayanna thought of him at all, if their brief time together held the same weight for her that it did for him, or if she had moved on with the practicality of a warrior who understood that survival meant not dwelling on what could never be. He imagined her in the stronghold, surrounded by her people, returned to the rhythms of a life that existed outside the comprehension of men like him, and he took comfort in the image even as it emphasized the vast distance, not just geographical but cultural and spiritual, that now separated them forever. Word filtered south occasionally about the continuing conflicts in Arizona, about skirmishes and treaties broken before the ink could dry, about the slow, grinding reduction of Apache territory and freedom that seemed as inevitable as the sunrise. Each report was a knife in Elijah's chest, a reminder that his act of individual mercy had done nothing to change the larger forces crushing the people who had spared his life. He had saved one woman, but could not save her world, and the futility of it sometimes threatened to overwhelm whatever fragile peace he had managed to construct in his exile. He was working on a ranch outside a small town, whose name he never bothered to learn when the stranger found him, a Mexican man of middle years whose bearing suggested education and authority, despite his travel-worn appearance. The man approached as Elijah was repairing a section of fence in the brutal midday heat, his demeanor suggesting this was not a casual encounter, but something planned and purposeful. They spoke in a mixture of Spanish and English, the stranger's questions careful and oblique at first, testing Elijah's identity and history with the skill of someone trained in interrogation or investigation. Eventually, after an hour of circular conversation under the punishing sun, the stranger revealed the purpose of his visit. He had been sent by someone who wished to express gratitude, someone who wanted Elijah to know that his sacrifice had not been forgotten, and that, while circumstances made any direct contact impossible, there were those who honored what he had done and wished him well in his exile. The messenger did not speak a name. The risk was too great for all involved, but his meaning was clear enough to make Elijah's heart hammer in his chest, with a mixture of hope and anguish. Ayanna was alive, she was well, and in whatever capacity her circumstances allowed, she remembered him and wished him to know that his act had meaning beyond its immediate consequences. The stranger departed as mysteriously as he had arrived, leaving Elijah standing in the Mexican sun with tears streaming down his weathered face, his hands gripping the fence post with enough force to drive splinters into his palms, his entire body shaking with emotions he had thought himself too damaged to still feel. Years accumulated like dust in the corners of a forgotten room, each one adding its weight to Elijah's exile and slowly transforming him from a fugitive hiding from his past into something approaching a settled member of the community that had reluctantly adopted him. The work remained hard, the loneliness remained constant, but time performed its ancient alchemy, turning sharp grief into dull ache, immediate loss into distant memory. He learned proper Spanish, adopted local customs, and eventually found himself running a small ranch of his own. Nothing grand, just enough land to support a modest herd and a simple existence far from the conflicts that continued to rage north of the border. The Apache Wars finally ground to their bitter conclusion, the last free bands surrendering or being hunted into extinction, the survivors relegated to reservations that were prisons in all but name. Elijah read the reports when newspapers found their way to his remote corner of Mexico, each article a chronicle of tragedy that he felt powerless to affect or alleviate. He thought often of Ayanna, wondering which fate had claimed her, the reservation with its slow death of culture and spirit, or continued resistance with its almost certain violent end. He had no way of knowing and no means of finding out, the barrier between their worlds now absolute and reinforced by the full weight of law and military force. He was an old man by any frontier standard, past 50 and feeling every year of it in his bones, when the second messenger came. This one was younger than the first, an Apache man of perhaps 30, who appeared at Elijah's ranch with the sudden materialization that seemed characteristic of his people, there one moment when the space had been empty the instant before. The young warrior carried no weapons that Elijah could see, but his bearing made clear he needed none, that he was capable of lethal violence if circumstances required it, but had not come seeking conflict. He spoke English with the fluid competence of someone who had been educated in the white man's schools, though his eyes held a wildness that no amount of imposed civilization could fully tame. The message he carried was simple and devastating in its implications. Ayanna had survived the wars, though at costs the messenger did not elaborate on, and had been living on the San Carlos reservation, in conditions that the warrior's face suggested were barely tolerable. She wanted Elijah to know that she had never forgotten his sacrifice, that the story of his act had been passed down through her family, and had become a treasured piece of their oral history, a tale they told when they needed to remember that goodness could exist even in the darkest times. She wanted him to know that she had lived a full life, despite the constraints of the reservation, that she had children and grandchildren who carried her spirit forward into a future that looked nothing like the past, but held possibilities nonetheless. And she wanted him to know one thing more, that in the worldview of her people, the act of liberating someone at great personal cost created a spiritual bond that transcended the physical separation of bodies or even the passage of time. That in saving her life, he had woven their spirits together in a way that would persist beyond this existence, into whatever lay on the other side of death. She had no expectation of seeing him again in this world, no illusions that the barriers between them could ever be breached. But she wanted him to understand that in the moments when she sat beneath the stars and thought of all the paths her life had taken, she always returned with gratitude to that night when a disillusioned soldier had looked at a caged woman and chosen humanity over compliance. The warrior departed as quietly as he had arrived, leaving Elijah standing in the doorway of his modest ranch house, the Mexican sunset painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed almost unbearably beautiful in their intensity. He thought of Ayanna on her reservation, of the impossible gulf of miles and circumstances that separated them, of the brief moment of connection they had shared that had somehow defined the rest of both their lives. He had given up everything to free her, his home, his country, his identity, and in return she had given him something far more valuable, proof that he was capable of choosing right over easy, that some core of decency still existed within him, despite all the years of compromise and moral erosion. The world they had inhabited, that violent collision of cultures and peoples, had ground onward in its brutal way, caring nothing for individual acts of mercy or the bonds forged between unlikely souls. The Apache had been defeated, their lands stolen, their way of life shattered, and nothing Elijah had done had changed that trajectory. Yet standing in the fading light, feeling the weight of years and distance pressing down on his shoulders, he found himself able to accept the trade he had made. He had lived long enough to know that Ayanna had survived, that their brief connection had held meaning for her as it had for him, and that in a world that seemed determined to crush all tenderness and honor beneath the boot heel of conquest, they had managed to create something that endured beyond the immediate circumstances that had brought them together. He would never see her again, would never know the details of her life beyond what the messengers had deemed safe to share. But he carried her in his heart, as she apparently carried him in hers. Two people from opposed worlds who had found in each other a reflection of who they wished to be, rather than who the frontier demanded they become. The act of opening that cage had cost him everything measurable: home, belonging, security. But it had returned to him something he had thought lost forever in the death of his family and the brutality of his service, the knowledge that he was capable of love, of sacrifice, of choosing another person's freedom over his own safety. As darkness settled over the Mexican landscape and the first stars began their nightly emergence from the deepening blue, Elijah Thorne smiled for the first time in years, a tired old man at peace with the choices that had defined his life and the love that had saved his soul, grateful beyond measure for the fierce Apache woman who had given him a reason to remember why being human mattered, even when the cost of that humanity was everything he owned. This story reminds us that courage is not always found in grand gestures or public declarations, but sometimes in the quiet moments when we choose to see another person's humanity, despite everything our world tells us to ignore it. In the harshest landscapes and the darkest times, it is these small acts of defiance against cruelty that define who we truly are. If this journey moved you, if Elijah and Ayanna's story touched something in your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching this from, and share what this tale meant to you. And if you want to experience more stories of courage, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next adventure we have waiting for you.